Frozen wastelands, murderous hordes, kings who wiped out entire civilizations. History can be brutal. Find out how bad it got on this episode of the Infographics Show. Worst time in history to be alive. One of the worst times to be alive as a human being was actually one of the first. The first early hominins evolved around 4.2 million years ago, with Neanderthals walking the earth around 400,000 years ago. Homo sapiens would follow them around 300,000 years ago, and the age of humans began. In those days, humanity lived a simple existence, surviving off the land. The earliest humans were hunter-gatherers, finding plants that were edible often by trial and error, and hunting large animals with simple tools. Cooking was rudimentary, but our human ancestors had mastered controlled fire over 1 million years ago. It was a basic but sustainable existence, at least until nature had something to say about that. Around 100,000 years ago, humanity was faced with the biggest challenge in its short existence, the Ice Age. This was a part of a cycle of glaciation that saw ice sheets grow. This resulted in a massive expansion of ice coverage and cold weather, to the point that ice sheets covered most of northern North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels dropped, deserts increased, and the areas that were hospitable to life decreased. And unlike the current society, if temperatures dropped, early humans had limited options for surviving in the cold. But it wasn't the only problem they were facing. The mass increase in glaciers began around 33,000 years ago, and it reached its peak around 26,000 years ago. But humanity had already seen a major change in their living situation, and it may have been partially their own fault. The megafauna were going extinct. The age of the giant mammals was drawing to a close, primarily due to the change in Earth's environment. As the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere decreased, the changes in plant life made it harder for those animals to survive. Heavy human hunting also played a role, and the late Pleistocene saw an extinction of hundreds of species, and that created a harsh new world for the humans. So how did humanity survive in their first major global test as a species? Fortunately, humanity had been evolving fast. Their large brains had developed speech and advanced planning, which meant that they could communicate and start working in groups. While there weren't permanent settlements at this point, the smaller groups could tell stories to each other, warning about the dangers and creating legacies. As they traveled from place to place, oral storytelling and art became critically important to understand the world. And this is the period where massive cave paintings at sites like Lascaux in France were formed. And fortunately, there were still plenty of prey. As plants became harder and harder to come by, the sources of protein became more critical. Reindeer and bison were heavily hunted during this period and used for both food and clothing. The thick hides were effective Ice Age coats. While larger animals like woolly mammoths and giant sloths were rarer to come by, they were often hunted by packs of humans. This was also the era where tools became more widely used, with the invention of the needle making it much easier to design clothing. And rudimentary construction got its start, as durable rock shelters provided critical shelter from the worst of the weather. It was one of the hardest, most unpredictable times to be alive. For the humans living in it, it was just another day. But sometimes nature isn't the worst enemy humanity has, it's other humans. It was the 1200s, and history was being made. The Mongol Empire under the leadership of Genghis Khan was the largest empire that ever existed, and to this day it remains the largest contiguous political empire that has ever been created. It spanned from Central Europe all the way to China, as the Mongol leader cut through any opposition that stood in his way. Today he is still revered for his brilliant military tactics and his incredible control over his armies, and loathed for his brutality, to the point that he is basically synonymous with evil. Because to be there when the Mongol Empire came calling was one of the worst times in human history to be alive. Genghis Khan was known for preferring to conquer without resistance. He viewed his conquest as an inevitable fact of nature, and he would approach the leadership of opposing nations to offer them a chance to surrender. For those who did, they would become part of the Mongol Empire and get its protection for a price. You wanted to keep the great Khan happy, and sending regular tributes was mandatory. Once the Mongols conquered your land, you didn't just lose your home, you became a part of their war machine. Occupied regions were often forced to send their own people to fight in the Mongol army. Those who resisted would face none of this, as they were wiped out. Many empires have conquered territory, but few have ever raised it to the extent that the Mongols did. If a culture resisted in any way, the Mongols would seek to make an example of them, committing mass slaughter of populations and destruction of their territory. The goal wasn't just to force their surrender, but to send a message to the next territory to be conquered. Surrender now, or this could be what awaits you. And some of the horrors committed still shock historians to this day. While the era of the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th century isn't as well documented, it's believed that this may have been the largest-scale genocide in history, with many reports of deaths in the millions in specific locations, like the Iranian city of Merv. Given the dozens of cities and territories the Mongols conquered in their march across Eurasia, historians estimate that the empire killed at least 20 million people and possibly as many as 60 million, a number that even the worst modern dictators couldn't approach. But it wasn't just the killing, it was the cruelty. This was long before there were any rules governing warfare, but Mongol tactics horrified many historians. The Mongols were one of the first to use biological warfare, using cadavers who died of the Black Plague as weapons and hurling them into cities to spread the disease. The virus played a key role in depopulating Europe, and while it spread independently in Western Europe, it was key to the attack here. The Mongols would also target food sources, burning crops and farmland to starve the population. They would frequently announce their arrival with a cruel act of public killing and leave monuments to their massacres when they departed. And in their wake, they left a terrifying void. The loss caused by the Mongol Empire is incalculable. In some regions, the destruction was so total that entire chapters of history were erased, leaving a century-long gap in history and literature. It's believed that the army simply burned all traces of culture they encountered, with China taking a particularly heavy price. The strength and brutality of the Mongol Empire was unbeatable, and their cruelty was so vicious that the people at the time simply had to wait it out. And their prayers were answered when Genghis Khan died and his successors couldn't maintain the empire. The next period didn't have one ruthless empire, it had two. The Mongol Empire was a distant memory by 1618, and Europe had risen to be the world's dominant power. The age of colonialism was in full swing, and countries like England, France, Germany, Belgium, and Spain had begun spreading around the world. What could stop the momentum? What else but internal conflict? The dawn of Protestantism in the 16th century had posed the biggest challenge to the Roman Catholic Church in centuries, and they were pushing back. After many smaller conflicts, an uneasy truce was reached, and then naturally, someone decided to blow it up. At this point, the Holy Roman Empire was more of a land title held by the House of Habsburg, but that didn't make them any less powerful, ruling over 8 million people in Austria, Hungary, and what was then Bohemia. The Reformation led to splits in the territory, as some areas became Protestant and several small conflicts erupted. But this internal German conflict exploded into a massive war as Archduke Ferdinand took the throne in 1608, instituting a much harsher policy toward Protestants. This led to a revolt in Bohemia, who elected their own king, Frederick. Soon, Spain, deeply tied to Rome, stepped in, eager to shape the outcome to its advantage. And it kicked off a war that would span 3 decades. The 30 Years' War would go on to become one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, and certainly the worst until the 2 world wars of the 20th century. Soon the Dutch Republic got involved as well, and territories like Denmark and Sweden were pulled in whether they wanted to be or not. While the war was initially confined to the eastern territories controlled by the Holy Roman Empire, it soon became a much larger conflict, and one that would devastate the continent. As Emperor Ferdinand, who was closely aligned with Spain, continued his march, he was soon opposed by France, who was invested in not seeing the Habsburgs dominate Europe. In the end, a peace treaty would be signed in 1648. France gained the upper hand and achieved independence for former Roman holdings like Bavaria and Saxony, which would be closer to France diplomatically. But it came at a horrible price. It's estimated that between 4.5 million and 8 million died in the conflict, and the majority of them weren't soldiers. The destruction caused a massive increase in famine and disease, with the civilians suffering. Germany in particular saw declines in population of over half in some areas, and while France won the war and quickly expanded its territory, it would be Great Britain who was ultimately the biggest winner. They largely stayed out of the conflict and would be ready to strike as the age of the empire began around the world. And that rush to colonize the world would lead to one of the biggest crimes the world had ever seen. In Belgium, in the late 19th century, life was good. The King, Leopold II, was a pretty standard European constitutional monarch. He had gained a reputation as the king builder for his ambitious infrastructure program around the country. It was truly impressive how much money the guy seemed to have. There seemed to be no limit to the number of projects that he could greenlight, and it all came down to the Congo Free State. a wildly successful colonialist project that brought resources back from the large African state. And it just so happened to be hiding one of the worst humanitarian disasters in human history. Leopold had portrayed the acquisition of the Congo as part of a humanitarian project, but he didn't actually rule it as a standard colony. Instead, he turned it into a corporate holding designed to do one thing and one thing only: enrich him and his country. The entire country was transformed into a source for resources. The land would be pillaged of its resources, starting with ivory that required the mass killing of animals. Then it was the minerals that could be mined and rubber that could be derived from the plants. But that meant that he needed another resource: workers. It's been said that the Congo Free State was one of the largest slavery operations in human history. Practically the entire population of the massive state was put to work in one of these industries. The territory was ruled by Leopold's private agents and a large army of brutal enforcers. The Congo Basin was split into 4 districts, all of them having a governor that answered solely to the king. While no slave trade actually happened within the territory, the population was likely to be forced into an industry beneficial to Leopold, and enforcement was brutal and sadistic. As the Congo Free State was initially a money pit, Leopold committed to extremely aggressive measures, starting with confiscating any land that wasn't currently in use. Congolese communities were soon banned from trading with anyone but the state economy, and that quickly turned into quotas to provide ivory and rubber to their colonial masters. As the automobile industry was growing, the demand for rubber skyrocketed, and those who failed to meet their quota would face harsh punishments. And the horrors of the Congo Free State slowly began to come to light. Many of the workers were flogged for failing to meet quotas, and as demand increased, so did Leopold's brutality. Workers would have their families taken hostage to ensure compliance, and workers who failed would be killed or have their hands cut off. Soldiers were ordered to collect their hands as trophies, proving that they hadn't wasted any ammo. Whole villages would be burned if they refused to cooperate. Due to the extreme starvation in the area, the local army, trusted with enforcing Leopold's will, even resorted to cannibalism. And the punishment for the masterminds was very little. For those on the ground, they were living through one of the greatest horrors in human history. The human toll of the genocide in the Congo will never fully be known, but the death toll was at least 1.5 million and could have gone as high as 10 million. The king never faced justice for his crimes, but as word of the atrocities came out, he was eventually forced to give up direct control of the Congo Free State and turn it over to the country as a formal colony. His brutal policies were liberalized, but the scars on what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo have never quite healed. Not all dark periods come from oppressed nations. Some can even happen to the most powerful country in the world. It was the Roaring '20s. America had its most brutal decade in a long time behind it, as World War I was over and the Spanish flu was in the rearview mirror. The economy was rising, the cities felt like one big party, and everyone was looking forward to a future that didn't involve military engagement. Presidents like Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover were low-profile bureaucrats who didn't make too many waves, and they were mainly keeping a hands-off pro-business approach to the economy. But just because they didn't want to do the economy didn't mean the economy wasn't gonna do them. The issues leading to the Great Depression were building for a long time, including a return to the gold standard and the lack of government oversight to protect holdings. But what happened unfolded quickly. In October 1929, a large sell-off of stocks began, and by October 24th, a massive sell-off saw the stock market crash 11% at the opening bell. That caused a massive sell-off out of panic, and an even bigger drop the next day. Countless investors lost everything. Many businesses went out immediately as their stocks went to zero, and over the next few years, the stock market would lose 85% of its value. And that would cause shockwaves that hit just about everywhere. As the crisis continued, desperate people tried to withdraw their money, causing runs that emptied banks of their money, leaving them unable to fulfill people's accounts. As the Bank of the United States wasn't able to fulfill its obligations to its creditors, it went under, taking its deposits with it and bankrupting countless people. With all the businesses closing and the banks failing, people found themselves impoverished out of nowhere. Many couldn't even afford their houses or food for their family. And then the government naturally said, "We're here to help." The government responded to the initial crisis with a hammer rather than a scalpel. They imposed high tariffs on foreign imports as an attempt to force companies to do business and provide jobs for people. But all this did was spread the pain. Many companies simply didn't have the resources to invest here, and this made it impossible for them to import what they needed. and it spread chaos across the world as many countries saw their trade with the US curtailed. This increased political instability as the desperation saw many countries welcome in socialist dictatorships. And on the ground, many people in the US started to wonder if there was a better way out. The effects of the Great Depression hit the people of the US across the board. In cities, homelessness increased massively, with people walking the streets with boards begging for a job. Others sought out greener pastures, but nature had something else to say about that. A series of severe dust storms and droughts known as the Dust Bowl devastated the American agricultural sectors for years in the 1930s, worsening the effects of the Great Depression. This made food harder to get and brought much of the suffering of the cities to rural areas. There would be an end in sight, but it wouldn't be easy. When progressive Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in 1932, he set out to reshape the nation with bold reforms and a brand new social safety net. But while his New Deal laid the groundwork for lasting change, it wouldn't solve America's problems overnight. And in Europe, the economic devastation of the past war led to the rise of authoritarians, most notably Adolf Hitler, who began his march across Europe. Ironically, the inevitable coming of World War II would boost the U.S. economy as production for the conflict ramped up. But that would just mean changing one terrible time in history for another. But one time in history was worse than any other for one reason: the sheer, terrifying uncertainty if there would even be a tomorrow. The Permian extinction, around 250 million years ago, saw the extinction of close to 90% of species on Earth. It was the closest life on Earth ever came to ending altogether. At least until the 1950s, World War II was over, having come to a close with two earth-shattering explosions that began the nuclear age. The US was the first one to get the atomic bomb, but the UK, France, and the Soviet Union soon followed. And that last one was the problem. The days of FDR and Stalin working together were long over. The US and the Soviets were on a collision course, possibly a nuclear one. While the 1950s was a good time for America in many ways, the economy was growing, technology was accelerating, and the baby boom was kicking off. But there was one big X factor: fear. As soon as it became clear that the Soviets had the bomb, no one knew when the unstable Soviet leader Joseph Stalin would start a war. After his death, he would be replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who was less cruel but more overtly belligerent, relishing the possibility of open conflict with the United States. And that conflict would come close to being a few times. The US and the Soviets both built up their arsenals massively, with each having enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire world several times over. That meant if one button got pushed, it would mean the end of everything, and not just the two countries involved. It also meant that one person could make a mistake that would cost the world everything and put an end to millions of years of evolution. And with little the average person could do to determine their fate, they did the only thing that made sense. They convinced themselves they had more power than they did. Nuclear drills were common in those days, with people preparing for what they could do if the bombs dropped and they had minutes to act. People built state-of-the-art bomb shelters packed away with years of supplies if they needed to hide somewhere for the duration of the war. No one was sure if they could even sustain a nuclear blast, but it provided some peace of mind, and children everywhere were taught to duck and cover under their desks if there was ever an attack when they were at school, something that had a near zero chance of success. But during this period, humanity's fate hung in the balance almost every day. Small decisions would play a key role in nuclear conflicts. Soldiers and spies from either side would be taken hostage by the other, forcing tense negotiations. Both sides engaged in brinksmanship, moving nuclear weapons close to enemy territory and daring the other side to stop them. This most famously escalated into the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets tried to arm Fidel Castro's new dictatorship with missiles, close enough to make Miami Beach ground zero. And believe it or not, that wasn't even the closest the world came to ending. The terror of the Cold War continued into the 1980s, when the Soviet Defense Forces got a false alarm of an incoming missile from the United States. The man in charge happened to be Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel who didn't think that this made sense. Despite military protocol telling him to launch, he held off, refraining from a nuclear attack on U.S. soil that likely would have provoked a world-ending nuclear exchange. Even in the dying days of the Cold War, one mistake nearly ended the world, leading to decades of stress and trauma for the people living through it. If you thought the Cold War was terrifying, click to see what happened when civilization completely collapsed and why the Dark Ages were the worst time to be alive.